Okay, good evening everyone. It's great to see you here. My name is David Wheeler and I'm Dean of the Faculty of Management here at DALHOUSIE. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special event. Today has actually been a very special day. People will have noticed that we've had our convocation reception outside, and it's always a joyous time of year. But today has been very special for me for reasons beyond that. I mean, that would be special enough. This morning at the ASAC conference, which a number of people in the room were at, we had the most fabulous panel discussion. Peggy Cunningham here was part of that. Around responsible business and how does responsible business become mainstream. It was a riveting panel, and Ed Freeman, who's our guest this evening, was the principal discussant on that, and we had a really, really excellent session. So to have that at the beginning of the day, and then to have the pleasure of Ed's company at the end of the day is a real treat. So probably all of you will be aware of Ed's contribution to management theory and to strategy and to business ethics. Ed teaches at the Darden School, but previously has taught in other places, Wharton and elsewhere. He's a multiple award-winning teacher, someone who very much puts his students first, but who also has been a prolific author on responsible business and is the generally acknowledged founder of the stakeholder theory of the firm, which is a theory and approach which certainly suits the style of this faculty of management, but I think increasingly suits the style of progressive and sensible business schools and faculties of management around the world. So Ed's contributions to this field tower above anyone else's contributions, I have to say. And he's long been a friend and a mentor of mine. I'm not alone in claiming that. There's so many people in this field who have been inspired and supported by Ed over the years. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Ed to you this evening. So this event is brought to you as a joint venture between DALHOUSIE and the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. Again, many of you will be affiliated with or will know the work of the Canadian Centre, and Chris Stover is here and has been diligently working with us on this event. So thank you, Chris, and thank you to your Centre for that. As people will know, the Centre is a joint initiative of the Atlantic School of Theology and St Mary's University, and increasingly we're finding ourselves doing projects with St Mary's and even contemplating joint degrees and that kind of thing with St Mary's. So it's really nice to see the schools collaborating more and more in Halifax. I think that's really important. So I know we're going to have a great time this evening. You will find Ed to be extremely self-deprecating and modest, but also I think he will engage us and tell a few jokes along the way. That's his normal style. And I am just so pleased that he's with us here this evening and sharing his perspective on Beyond Scandal, the real ethics crisis in business. So please join with me in welcoming Dr. Edward Freeman.
David, thank you very much, and thanks to you and to Chris and to DALHOUSIE and the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs for inviting me. It's a real treat for me to be back in Canada, back in Halifax, where I spent a little bit of time some years ago. Most Americans pretend to be Canadian when they travel abroad, and it's nice to be here and to be reminded why we pretend to be Canadian. Not on the negative side, everyone knows about that, but on the positive side, about what a terrific place this is and what terrific conversation you have going on about sustainability and responsibility in society. It's a real privilege to be here. I've had a great few days talking with some really interesting people, some old friends like David and some new ones that I've met and hope to continue to have conversations with. So it's been really a terrific trip for me, and I'm very grateful to you for that. I want to share with you tonight a sort of report from the field is the way I guess I'd put it. I have kind of the best job in the world. And if you don't let it get back to my dean, I'd do it even if they didn't pay me. I get to teach. I have terrific students. I have great colleagues. Ethics is taken for granted at the Darden School. We've been doing it for a long time. It's Jefferson's University in the honor system. So it's kind of in the air there. We have research centers and all this kind of stuff. And I get to teach and write and kind of bang around businesses all over the world thinking about sort of what's going on with ethics. Now, I'm a philosopher by training, so I'm not burdened down by a lot of knowledge about anything. And so, in fact, the first course in management I had, I'll confess to you, was the first one that I taught. And so I've not ever known what was like a bad question to ask. It was through ignorance, not through any design. And so I want to share with you tonight at least some of what I've learned over the last 25, 30 years of just frankly not knowing enough to know when I was being pretty stupid. And so I want to share with you some lessons from someone who has been sort of banging around businesses trying to understand desperately what was going on without much preconception. Now look, I tell somebody I teach business ethics. You know what they say. They say, I didn't know business had any. They say oxymoron, two words, you put them together, contradiction, like, jumbo shrimp, American foreign policy, it's actually three. Or my favorite, must be a short course. Or a recent one, I was in a hotel in Copenhagen, and so I said, well, what do you do? I said, I teach business ethics. And he goes, well, that's like a theoretical course, isn't it? And I've come to live with this joke for 30 years, and I have come to the conclusion that the joke is the problem. Right? And I mean that in a way quite seriously. And I hope to convince you, or at least have you entertain the thought by the end of the evening, that we need to move from business ethics as an oxymoron to business ethics as a pleonasm. Pleonasm's not anything, sort of dirty or anything like that. It's two words that you put them together, they're redundant, like true fact. If it's a fact, it's true. You don't need both of those. And so I hope to have you entertain the idea that we come to see business ethics as really a redundant phrase. Right? Well, what I want to do is I want to start by, in a sense, suggesting that we need a revolution. I want to talk about the old story of business, the one I think is not very interesting anymore, what I hope to be an outline of a new story about business, and what's the role of responsibility, sustainability, and ethics in that, and to suggest one way to think about how value creation works. Along the way, I want to share with you some of the things I've heard from executives as I've traveled all over the world and spent way too much of my time on airplanes. So what about this idea that we need a revolution in business? What does that mean? We've seen in business really unprecedented change. And you have to be a little bit careful about that. No one ever writes a book that says, well, thank God things are settling down now. It's always about change and unprecedented change. I went back and read a book about business in the turn of the century, and people said things like, well, the world's really small now. And boy, this telegraph is really going to change things, and telephone, this technology is going to change things. And so you have to be a little bit skeptical about that. But when you think about it, when you think about globalization, and you think about the impact of globalization, when I'm not in the U.S. or Canada and people say, explain globalization, I say, even Americans get it. Even we all understand that it's a world in which India and China and Denmark and South Africa and Brazil and Russia and Japan are just as relevant as Charlottesville and Halifax and Toronto and Washington. We truly live in a very different world. Our children will grow up in a world which is, in a sense, smaller than it's ever been, in my view. A second piece of change is that no one, well, maybe people in Venezuela are arguing this, but very few people are arguing we need more state-owned enterprise. We've seen a massive liberalization in governments. I don't mean liberal in the sense of political party liberal. I mean liberalization in the sense that governments have figured out they don't need to own assets. They can sell the assets, privatize, put the risk on somebody else, and keep the regulatory authority. And you see everywhere, from the privatization of industry in China to the privatization of post and telecom and electricity, all over the world. You see this move sort of sweeping the world of selling off of assets and government to keep, in a sense, the regulatory authority. We've seen in this same time period a radical increase in thinking about sustainability, thinking about the environment, thinking about the fact that we haven't been very good at that for a long time. With that, and with this liberalization of government, has come the idea that people expect businesses to be active on social issues, from everywhere of keeping a community clean to trying to bridge the gap between rich and poor and north and south. And all of this is brought to you in part by the fact that I'm sure we probably have more information technology and computing power in this room when people get their laptops out than existed in the world 30 or 40 years ago. Our children will grow up in a world that is truly wired and connected with the very real possibility that all of the world's knowledge is available on the desktop. It's said in the Western world that John Stuart Mill was perhaps the last person to know everything that could be known. Well, our children will be able to Google everything that could be known, it seems to me. And we don't yet know what kind of human beings we're going to be in that world. Now, if that's not change enough, add to that, in business terms, the scandals. Enron, Parmalat, I hope there have been some Canadian ones. I know there have been some Danish ones. And I'm able to say even the Danes have scandals in business. And I'm a professor at the Copenhagen Business School, and the Danes are really nice about that sort of stuff. But even the Danes have had scandals in business. The oil for food scandal, the mortgage meltdown, all those kinds of things are there on top of all this other change. And my argument is the old story, the way we think about business, simply must be revised. Why talk about stories? Why talk about background narratives? I want you to think for a second about the importance of stories that run in the background, stories that we don't often question their assumptions about. Think for a minute about the background narrative that we had not too long ago, and still have in some places, about gender. That background narrative went like this. Men and women weren't equal. Women should do domestic work. Men should do real work. And that background narrative had a grip on our minds for a very long time. We had to change the background narrative. We had to come to see men and women as equal. When we changed the narrative, we enacted social change that went with that to create a world that, in my view, is far better. Think about the background narrative about race. Think about the background narrative about First Nation people. Think about the background narratives that we have about what a family is. These narratives work in the background in our minds, and they cause us to frame problems that we don't often think about how we're framing them. My suggestion is that we have a background narrative about business, and it goes something like this. Business is about making money, and it's about profits. It's really about the money. The only group that really matters is shareholders. And in the famous words of Milton Friedman, business is about maximizing profits for shareholders. Now, Friedman said some other stuff as well, but that gets attributed to him as well. Capitalism, business works because we're all, I apologize for my language, greedy little bastards out trying to do each other in. Capitalism works, it's anything goes, and given the opportunity, business people will lie, cheat, and steal more than the average, cut corners, do anything possible to make a profit. Business works primarily because of the competitive instinct. People are competitive, they're greedy, and then as if by an invisible hand, the story goes, the greatest good emerges. If you don't think this is the background story, listen to the news. Talk to your children's teachers and friends. Read the papers. You'll hear the story. Once you become aware of it, you'll hear the story in almost everything that's written about business. And for my money, this is a story that is deeply disrespectful of human beings, and is a story that is really, if it was ever useful, it's certainly not useful now. I had an occasion to teach a class in organization behavior at a large Midwestern university in Wisconsin recently. Each one of these principles was clearly articulated to me by undergraduate students who simply knew they were true. They said things like, well, you know, I'd take the money because it's a business. Implying that, of course, business is only about the money. Or, I would look at this proposal from my competitor because this is a business. Meaning, I'll cheat and it's okay because it's a business. My argument is this background story needs to change. Is it that business is about profits and money? Or is business primarily, or could business be primarily about purpose? I'm not trying to suggest that this news story completely describes the way business is. I am suggesting it describes the way some businesses are, and it certainly describes what we should aspire to. So I want to suggest that we come to see business as primarily about purpose, that money and profits follow. In a way, I want to suggest we kind of made a logical mistake. If I'm going to exhaust my knowledge of physiology here now. We all need red blood cells to live. Anybody want to argue with that? But it doesn't follow that the purpose of life is to make red blood cells. Businesses have to have profits to exist. In fact, I'm even willing to say with my finance colleagues that they must have profits at what they call the weighted average cost of capital. I'm certainly willing to say that. But it doesn't follow that the purpose of a business is to make as much money as possible, to make as much profits as possible. The purpose of my life is not to make red blood cells, even if I have to spend the time, as I did recently, concentrating on making red blood cells. It never follows that the purpose of life is only to make red blood cells. And I believe we've gotten that wrong in business. And that's why we have this obsession with profits. Right? Secondly, so for instance, purpose might be something like medicines for people, not for profits. Purpose might be something like we believe in bringing goods and services to people that can't afford them. Purpose might be something like, you may disagree with this, but everyday low price. Purpose might be something like poverty belongs in a museum. Purpose might be something like rid the world of diabetes. Purpose might be something like help people finance their dreams. Purpose might be something like bring good food and wine to people in this community. All of those are purposes that have been articulated by businesses that need to make money, but that's an outcome, that's a secondary thing. They have to make red blood cells to live. That's not what gets them out of bed. I just don't know many people who get up in the morning, and maybe you're different, they get up in the morning and they go, yeah, let me go do something for those shareholders. I've just never met many people like that. And it seems to me this idea that it's profits that matter is flawed. Similarly, the idea that the only group that are shareholders matters. I have a friend who's a finance professor who I respect and enjoy talking to, who said to me, we're arguing about is it shareholders or stakeholders, and he said to me, well, Ed, we just want people to act like owners. And I said, oh, you mean the people who sell the stock at the slightest hint of bad news? And he said, well, not those owners. And I said, well, which ones are you talking about? Because those seem to be the only ones that are around. This idea that it's shareholders first completely misses the idea of what it takes to build and sustain a great business. Any business person worth their salt, small or large, entrepreneur or manager, knows that the way you build and lead a business is you have, this is a technical term, kick-ass products that customers want. You have suppliers who want to make you better, who want to deal with you because you're innovative, they're innovative. Together you're going to make your businesses better. You have employees who show up every day and are able to use their energy and their ideas to make the business better and to grow and develop themselves. You have communities who want you to be there because you're good citizens. You add to the community. You take care of the community. You don't screw it up. And if you do all those things, you're going to make money. So this idea that business is about creating value for shareholders seems to me to be completely 100% flat out dead wrong. It's not what capitalism is. It's certainly not what it can be. Are people really self-interested, or are people pretty complicated? Harry Levinson was a psychologist. He used to hang out at the Harvard Business School, and he would ask managers, how do people think about motivation in most companies? And all these managers would tell him rewards and punishment. And I've asked people the same question over the past few years, and they've told me exactly the same thing. Motivation's about rewards and punishment. Levinson would then go to the board, and I don't have the slide, but you can imagine it in your mind. Draw on one side of the picture a carrot, and another side of the picture a stick. And he would say, what animal is in between the carrot and the stick? And people would answer, a jackass. Right? It's a jackass that's between a donkey. That's between the carrot and the stick. And Levinson would say, look, hey, maybe human beings are not jackasses. Maybe they're a little more complicated than that. Maybe they have pretty serious emotional, spiritual, sexual, social lives. And they're more than going after carrots and avoiding sticks. The problem is, once you start treating people as jackasses, only in search of rewards and avoiding punishment, guess what? They start to act like jackasses. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Capitalism works, in my view, or should work, not because people are jackasses, but because they're complicated creatures. Anyone who has children knows that we're not completely self-interested. Our children would never, live past the age of 6 weeks. If that were true. Right? It's too tiring. And I say that as a father of twins. And, we do stuff for self-interested reasons. Of course we do. But we do stuff because we care about other people as well. And that goes on simultaneously in the human condition for all of us. And to believe that capitalism works because we're all self-interested, greedy little bastards seems to me to be completely demeaning. Of course incentives are important, but so are our values. We need a different way of understanding, it seems to me, why capitalism works. Well, this idea that people will cheat or cut corners, people think that business people lie, cheat, and steal more than the average. They think that business people are less ethical than doctors. They're less ethical than lawyers. That personally hurts me in America, maybe not here. And that the only group that business people beat in terms of their ethics is politicians. And I can tell you in the U.S. that's not much victory these days. Sumatra Ghoshal has suggested that business schools, by teaching this old model, have in a sense created a generation of people who actually think it might be okay to cheat, who think it might be okay not to act as to create value for stakeholders. For those of you from the academic world who are familiar with Prisoner's Dilemma, it turns out there's only one group of people who can't solve Prisoner's Dilemma, and that is economics graduate students who have been trained to be so rational that they can't figure out how to get the gains from cooperation. Does business work because people are competitive and greedy, or does business work because capitalism is the greatest system of social cooperation we've ever invented? I'm going to say that again. Capitalism is the greatest system of social cooperation we've ever invented. It is about how we work together to create something that no one of us can create alone. It is about how the interest of customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money go in the same direction rather than how they conflict with each other. Sure, competition is important. Some of my best friends are economists. In a free society, it gives you options, but the engine of capitalism is value creation in our desire to do things for others. And it seems to me we've kind of gotten this wrong. Ask entrepreneurs, as one of my former doctoral students, Laura Dunham, has done, why they start their businesses. And in addition to making money, which is important, they talked about what they're trying to do in the world, what they're trying to build, how they're oftentimes trying to make the world a better place. We see in today's world a massive renaissance of this idea, of entrepreneurs working all over the world, especially in the developing world, using the power of this value creation system to make people's lives better. And the old story simply doesn't work. We have to move, it seems to me, if you think about what this new story is, it's lots of elements of the old story reinterpreted, and ideas like corporate responsibility and sustainability and ethics, ethical leadership, social entrepreneurship, the role of civil society, all have to come to the center here rather than be pushed over to the edge. Somewhere in this I have a picture. There it is. That's that's the essence of my skill with PowerPoint. That we have to think about not 5 forces that shape competitive strategy, as Michael Porter would have us, but 4 forces of stakeholder capitalism. It's about value creation for stakeholders, not just shareholders. It's about responsibility. It's about sustainability and ethics, and those X's depict what you might call sort of the sweet spot where those things come together. And that's how you build, it seems to me, a great company, by figuring out how those things go in the same direction. So what I'd like to do for a few minutes is to say, well, Freeman, that's you as an academic, your take on things. What are people in the field saying? What are managers and chief executives and folks in business saying about this? Now, I want to say a couple of things about this. First of all, I'm going to have some passages here. They're not direct quotes. They're in part my interpretation of things. Sometimes they're direct quotes. But I want to be sure that I don't attribute these, I don't think, to anybody. But I think what you'll find is that there isn't much of the old model there. So one CEO says, corporate responsibility is really the most important issue of this century. I mean, he essentially went on to say, if we don't get this right, we're not going to be in business. It's not something that you got to do. I mean, it's not something that you may do, that may be optional, the way we used to think about it. Oh, isn't that company nice? They're socially responsible. But rather, it's something that we have to do, says the CEO of a fast-moving consumer goods company. Another one says, look, a socially responsible company has to meet a standard that's higher than the bottom line. There's this social compact that we have to deal with. That's a pretty rare statement coming from a financial services company, it seems to me. Another one says, well, we operate in a competitive environment, And there's lots of pressure to produce results. But ethics trade-offs don't work for us. They can, the phrase I like is, they can appear to have short-term advantages, but they usually don't. They certainly don't in the long run. Now I'm going to confess, lots of people would say social responsibility, sustainability, ethics, all that stuff I want to move to the center is fine in the long run. I have come to be radically suspicious of those people who want to make that argument. I think we have to make it work in the short run. Look, if ethics pays in the long run, and it doesn't start to pay at some point in the short run, it never pays, right? It pays out here, but it never pays at any point until we get here. Then it seems to me that's a bad argument. We need to figure out how to make ethics and social responsibility and value creation work together and pay in the short term, as it seems to me this CEO is saying as well. Today's world, the rules have changed. We've got to adapt to what that change is. This is a CEO who says, we publicize our ethics violations. The lawyers tell me I'm mad to do this, to say to people inside, we fired this person because of ethics reasons. But this particular CEO says, people got to know we're serious about this. Another CEO says, we got to pay attention to these things. Our recruits are asking lots of questions. And, by the way, whose standards are relevant to us? Whose do we use? Do we use the ones here in the U.S. or the ones in Canada or the ones in Vietnam or the ones in Australia? How do we sort these things out? This CEO says we got to move these questions to the center of the way we think about the business. Another one says, well, you get fired for missing on integrity, not for missing numbers. You might get put in the penalty box in this particular company for missing the numbers, but you wouldn't get fired. How does all this that help us figure out what to do, again, all over the world? Those questions have got to be in the center, not at the periphery. A CEO in the power industry that was really a company that really was on hard times, which was the Enron debacle, said, it's tough to be told every day by people in the old model, accountants and lawyers and consultants, that you're stupid. And we have these people come in every day and tell us how stupid we were for not doing off-books, balance sheet, Raptor kinds of stuff, where the accountants do some stuff and kind of money appears. And we didn't do any of that stuff because, it just didn't seem to make our customers any better off. Now, this company exists today, but it went through a pretty tough time because people in the industry didn't do it. Another CEO says, look, if we're going to take this stuff seriously, we have to figure out how to get people to push back. If I don't meet with this particular disgruntled employee, who I'm sure doesn't have very much to say, the next time somebody does have something to say, they won't meet with me. They won't tell me. So again, I've got to put this idea of ethics and responsibility in the very center of the way that I think about the business. And by the way, in none of these cases are these companies who have forgotten about making the numbers. That hasn't gone away. The pressure to meet the analyst expectations, the pressure to give returns, all that's still there. So it's all that stuff and ethics, responsibility, sustainability, etc. It's all that stuff and that. I don't know how you feel up here about the mortgage meltdown. It's stuff I don't really understand. But I thought it was neatly summed up by the CEO of U.S. Bank, who said, look, we just didn't see how lending customers money they couldn't really afford to pay back was a good idea. And I'm wondering if that kind of simple idea that says, look, our responsibility to our customers is at the center of the way we think about the business. Why, in a sense, is that? I don't think that's a terribly complicated principle, is it? But it seems to me that was missing somewhere in this whole thing that looks like it's going to cost an infinite trillion number of dollars now. Well, there are more of these. Well, one that's particularly relevant to me after listening to Stephen's speech the other day was, look, former CEO of a pharmaceutical company really said, you know, people don't have to die from AIDS now. The science has turned it into something like diabetes or high blood pressure. It's a chronic disease, but you don't really have to die. But millions of people are dying. And what he said was, not that there aren't, he didn't then go on to say, well, there are corrupt governments, etc., which is, you know, in part true. What he said was, there's no leadership in the industry. What he's saying is people in the industry are not putting these ideas kind of at center stage, and that, it turns out, is a moral outrage. Well, I'm not going to go through a lot more of these things. I think I've got one more here. So a couple of things on sustainability. This one's interesting. Sustainability, says an Italian packaging executive, is today what quality was in the 80s. We thought quality had a cost, and people talked about the cost of quality. What we found out was that, you know, in Cosby's words, quality is free, but what we really found out was that quality more than paid for itself. Of course, in the U.S., it was the Japanese industries that taught us this in a very hard way. And the U.S. automobile industry, the U.S. steel industry have not been the same. And this particular executive says sustainability is the same thing today. If you ask the question, what's the cost of being green, you'll never get there. You have to literally, in the words of another executive, walk off the cliff and be committed to being green, to doing better. Then what you'll find is the amount of innovation, etc., that's unleashed will far from pay for itself. There was a guy who ran a little chemical company named DuPont, and in the 90s he was tired of having DuPont be the dirtiest company on earth in all the newspapers. A man's name was named Edgar Willard, and he decided that DuPont was going to commit itself to a much better environmental record. At that time, they announced there was zero pollution. It's going to take a generation probably to get there, but they're going to do that. And he's going around making a speech to all the places that say, we got to do, we really mean this stuff. He's making a speech at one factory and one facility, and the people in the facility, the engineers tell him, there's no way we're going to meet these standards. This process is too dirty. This plant equipment's too old. We'll never meet these standards. And so he says, well, we're going to have to close the plant because we're serious about this. Engineers go away. They come back like maybe 3-4 weeks later. Miracle. We figured out how to do it. And so Willard, as I heard him tell the story, said, how much is it going to cost? $20-30 million. DuPont's a big company. And the engineer said, well, actually, we're embarrassed to tell you that if we do it this new way, we're going to save money. Right? And that's the logic of the way it seems to me values work. It's the way that the logic of sustainability works. The resource was, in the words of one executive, the only resources and assets I manage go up and down the elevator. The resource is what's between our ears. That's all that businesses have, it seems to me. What's between our ears and what's in our hearts. And bringing those values that are in our hearts and the knowledge that's between our ears into the same place, there is, in my view, great potential that's untapped. Well, we'll do one more here. I was listening to a guy from Nike, and he's been public about this, so I can say it. Look, they've had a lot of criticism about their factories and child labor, and they're trying to now get pressure to fix child labor from the flower fields. Why the flower fields die in their products comes from the flower fields. And this Nike executive, I don't know how to fix the flower fields. I'm trying to learn how to fix the factories. I'm going to have to learn how to fix the flower fields. Today's world, certainly iconic brands, but everyone, large companies, bear responsibility all the way up the value chain, which I would rather call the responsibility chain, and all the way down the value chain. down to the end uses that consumers make of their product. Not only do we hold Nike accountable for the dye, we're beginning to hold McDonald's accountable for us eating too much. Right? And so the idea that responsibility is something else out here, really it's about money and the shareholders, seems to me to be not a very interesting idea these days. So how do you do this stuff? And I'm happy to send copies of these to people if you want them. And I think one of the ways you do it is you take seriously this idea about stakeholders. We need to see capitalism as how we create value for stakeholders. And as I've tried to articulate that idea over the years, I think really there are a few principles that we can think about. One that I think is interesting is this idea that I think I got wrong for many, many years. For many years I focused on the idea, as many people who do stakeholder theory do, that stakeholder interests conflict and we need to trade them off with each other. So how do we trade off the interest of customers with the interest of shareholders? And I've come to believe that that's absolutely the wrong question to ask. The question is not how do stakeholder interests conflict with each other, and therefore how do we allocate value, but how can we harmonize the interests of stakeholders? And maybe this coincided with my taking up of playing the Hammond organ later in life, where harmony is a big deal. But it seems to me how we harmonize the interest of stakeholders is a far more interesting question than how do we make trade-offs. Look, I'm not sure of much, but I'm very certain about this. If what you looked for among a network of stakeholders is trade-offs, I am very certain that what you will find is trade-offs. Now, if you look for how to create value, how to get the interest of customers and communities going in the same direction, how to create products that customers want and need and make their lives better, that are clean in the community, that add value to suppliers that employees want to be involved with, and they make money. If you ask that value creation question, you might not find it. You might have to go back to trade-offs. But I'm certain you won't find it if you don't ask that question. So I want to suggest that the first and most important question in thinking about stakeholders is to ask this value creation question. How does stakeholder interests go together? How does what I'm doing for customers create value for what I'm doing with employees? How does the way I manage the employee relationship also create value for communities? We can always find trade-offs. But let's make that be a last resort rather than a first resort. The second thing I want to focus on is this business at the end here about dialogue and communication. I think one of the most interesting things, one of the most interesting differences, or lots of them, but one of the most interesting differences in U.S. and Canadian society is you've put some effort at having dialogue with stakeholders around public policy issues. And in U.S. society, dialogue's broken down. In fact, I'm just starting a new blog on, in a sense, trying to figure out how to get dialogue among stakeholders going again. How do we remoralize our institutions? How do we build dialogue so that we can get out of this fractured political system that focuses on our differences rather than what we have in common? I was in Norway. I was in Norway, Oslo, and I was doing a session with some folks, and a woman who ran a fishing company said to me, in the village where the fishing company is, we have some real critics because the fishing industry has been declining. And she said, how do you talk to your most difficult critics? Because it's tough to do. And I said, have you ever dealt with any teenagers? I had 3 at the time. And we'd been encouraging them to leave home while they were so certain about everything. And she said, yeah. And I said, can you talk to your teenagers? She says, yeah, well, sometimes it's tough. I said, well, critics can't be any harder to communicate with than teenagers. Right? But oftentimes as business people, what we want to do is talk to folks who reinforce what we believe. Now, think about what critics do for you. One way is to say, well, how do I get them to go away? Another way to deal with critics is to say, what are the critics telling me about my value creation process? What are the critics of the tobacco industry telling the industry? They're telling them people want the pleasure of smoking, if you believe it has some pleasure, those of you who have smoked, without the health risk. And until they can produce that, they haven't done the job for their customers. The source of value creation is in critics. What are some environmentalists saying? We want the kind of products and services. I mean, I personally want to drive an SUV because I live in kind of a deer video game park. Right? And it's not real safe to drive, small things like small SUVs. You need a big kind of Humvee kind of thing, and because they're everywhere. But I want an SUV that gets great gas mileage and that makes the environment cleaner. That's what and the companies won't have done the job until they do that. Is that outrageous? No, that's not outrageous. If you don't ask that question, you'll never get it. If you don't ask that question, you'll never get it. Whoever would have thought, I would have said 15 years ago, gee, I'd like something with more computing power than exists. I'd like it to be faster by 6 powers of 10. And by the way, I'd like it to weigh about 2.7 pounds. Right? And there it is. Right? We have to have intense communication with people who see the world differently. Our critics, our hardest customers, our most ornery employees. Because they are the sources of new business development. They're the sources of creativity and the sources of value creation. Well, the other issue here is that it seems to me we have to understand stakeholders as real people with names and faces and children, and not see stakeholders as roles. Business schools teach about customers. Customers are human beings with children. Human beings with children make promises. It's not about products and services. It's about the promises that companies make. Questions of ethics and responsibility have to be moved to the center, it seems to me. Well, there are lots of ways to do this. I've tried to do this in a book called Managing for Stakeholders, which makes a great doorstop, but that's probably all it will ever do. I want to end with a summary and 2 points. The summary is the story about business that says business is about creating shareholder value. It's about anything goes capitalism, and therefore we have an ethics crisis, is a mistake. We need the real ethics crisis is the fact that we need a new story about business. And it won't matter whether it's Enron now, whether it was the Teapot Dome scandal in the 20s in the U.S., whether it was the first Firestone scandal in the 1970s, or the latest one, or whatever the next scandal is going to be. And there'll be another one. Until we change the story, until we come to see capitalism as how we create value for stakeholders with ethics, responsibility, sustainability at the center of the value creation process, we're going to go from scandal to scandal to scandal. Now, I'm incredibly optimistic. I think we stand at a moment in time where we can do this. There's a moment now, given the scandals, given the change, where we really can leave to our children a view of capitalism that works far better than the one that we grew up with. That, I believe, is a noble enterprise for us to try to do. It's one that will take a great deal of work by a great many people, both people out realizing this story and many people trying to tell it. I get asked all the time, well, okay, so summarize this in the takeaway quotes. Business students like takeaway quotes. And I've got 2 for you. And one comes from a man you may not have heard of, a guitar player by the name of Warren Haynes. I was listening to Warren Haynes' give a lecture on a tape about how to play slide guitar so it sounds like you're not killing a cat slowly, and which mine does. And Warren Haynes says, now see, when you play the blues, it doesn't really matter how many notes you play. You just have to mean the notes that you play. In today's world, the pressure for business people to play a lot of notes, to do a lot of stuff, to respond to a lot of change is very large. Look at your calendars. They're impossible. Mine's impossible. I don't have a real job. Right? Business people's calendars are impossible today. They're doing a lot of stuff. We need a view of business and capitalism that helps us sort out what are the notes that we mean to play, where purpose is at the center, where values and principles are at the center. The second, perhaps more personal story, is a rule that I like to call the Ben, Emma, and Molly rule. Capitalism works when we can go home at the end of the day and say to Ben, Emma, and Molly, those are the names of my 3 kids, let me tell you what I did today. Let me tell you what I did today that I'm proud of, that I want you to learn from. Because if we aren't trying to make our institutions places for our children to live in, we've simply got the bar too low. I think we need to understand capitalism with a rather high bar, as trying to reinvigorate our institutions so that they're places we want our children to live in. Thank you very much.
So in a moment I'm going to ask Bill Black to say a few words of appreciation for that tremendous talk. Thank you, Ed. But if we have a few questions, I'm sure Ed would be happy to entertain them. We'll invite people to use the microphone if they have a question, and let's allow 10 minutes or so for this, and Ed, you can run the session however you want.
Sure, I'm happy. If you don't want to go to the mic, just give your question. I'll repeat it for the video as well. Loud exclamations of "that was awful" are okay too. I don't mind those. Yeah.
One stakeholder you didn't talk very much about was government, and of course, government. I'm not sure we should look at government as a source of integrity at all. But is there any role, or what should be the role of government to play in this new story?
Yeah, so what's the role of government in the news story? I think that's a really good question. And let me be clear and confess that I'm one of those kind of weird libertarians who kind of distrust the role of the state. That's not to say that there isn't a role for the state, and some places do it better than others, and I'm fine with that. But I also want to be sure that we don't use the state as an excuse for businesses not to be responsible. It's why, in effect, I'm actually sort of against the idea of social responsibility. Because I think what happens here, I'm not against the idea of responsibility, but social responsibility is a creature of the old story. Businesses are greedy and bad, according to the old story. But if you're socially responsible, all that's okay. And I want to suggest you have a responsibility that you got to take seriously to customers about products and services, to suppliers, to employees, to communities, and to shareholders. And if you take those responsibilities seriously and you're absolutely flat out 100% trying to fulfill those responsibilities, I don't know what social responsibility is left over. So I think government has a role. I don't think it's the regulatory role. The problem is governments have to have one-size-fits-all regulation, and that stifles innovation. Right? And I don't have much faith in that process. I'm happy if you do, and I'm happy for your optimism. That makes me feel a little bit better. I just don't have much of it. Right? Yeah.
Well, it's a terrific talk tonight, and I'm coming a long way, and I have a comment. Because I'm seeing the picture from far away, so maybe I can say something. I agree with you that the role of the government is is not necessarily to be the best to protect the customer, especially if the government itself, if it's protecting its own people, is not doing the same as the people living far away. If the factory is causing pollution in this country, you can move it to another country, even if you pride the people there. The many points in your talk draw my attention, including the one regarding the CEO of the pharmaceutical company who said AIDS, people should not die from AIDS in Africa. The one which drew my attention more, it was a former CEO.
Yeah.
I hope it was the one on the top of his job. Was he going to do that? Was he going to, or in any CEO of any company, his job is depending on how much profit he is bringing to this company. Would he say that?
Yeah. Good question about the role of the CEOs and whether or not their main job, they keep their job only because of profits, and how that works in kind of a global world where there are many pressures around that, where there are many alternatives for moving businesses from country to country. And it's a really interesting question. This particular CEO had not only kept his job, but been lionized as one of the great CEOs in history, precisely because he undertook a program of eradicating a particular disease that had no prospects of paying for itself in the standard way. Now, what he suggested was when they did this, happiness broke out in their research labs. And it turns out that they invented drugs, a long pipeline of drugs for a long time. His point was, if you look at it just in terms of profits, you sort of miss the point of the other value that you've created. And profit's an outcome. Profit's an outcome of people who are inspired, who show up to work every day inspired because of what you've done. Imagine a world in which you said, we are going to wipe out death from HIV in Africa. We're going to lead the process of doing that. What would it be like to show up at that company every day? I think you'd show up pretty pumped up to do that. And you'd have, again, you got to make money, so you got to find ways to make money at that. And I'm not suggesting that's easy to do. I'm suggesting I think he was right to express moral outrage that no leader had stepped forward to say that. Now, in fact, his former company has taken a leadership role, but in his view, not enough of a leadership role. That's a case, again, where government has stepped in, where NGOs have stepped in. Right? I want to say, let's raise the bar for companies. Let's raise the bar so that, companies say, hey, here's what we're going to do. Muhammad Yunus, the founder of their Grameen Bank, says poverty belongs in a museum. They're on the road. They're making people's lives better. That seems to me to be pretty noble, and it seems to me to be absolute capitalism. I'm suggesting that's the story of capitalism we ought to tell. So we think about business, we think about Merck, we think about the Grameen Bank, we think about Kiva, we think about the companies that are going out, they're making money, and they're creating value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, as well as the people with the money. That we come to see and teach that as the essence of capitalism, rather than you got to be greedy little bastards and do each other in. Because again, people enact the story that we tell. If we had time, I would do the demonization of business schools, but you can just imagine what I might say about that. And I think especially one of the interesting things that you do here at Dalhousie is you try and put sustainability and responsibility in the center of the business curriculum, and that's absolutely, in my view, the cutting edge of what we need to do. Right? Other questions? Yeah.
You gave us a great quote from a musician making a comment about success in business. There's another backstory that the musicians would know and the artists would know. It's probably as out of date as the business backstory. And that is, artists are poor but passionate. They can't make their ends work either. So the business backstory is they're all rich and greedy. those two backstories are outdated. So what's moving us towards, a new story? What are the forces in motion that are pushing us towards a new story?
Yeah, that's a good question. What are the forces in motion that are pushing us towards a new story? Because it's pushing us towards a new story in music as well. My son's a musician, so I have a special interest in this. I have one that's a musician, one that's an artist, and one that's a writer. I'd like to be able to retire someday, but it doesn't look like it. I think it's the same forces, and that is the globalization, the fact that in music, for instance, I can use the information technology, the communication technology, to be instantly known all over the world. I think the forces are exactly the same. They're forces about value creation, where no one company or institution has a stranglehold on that. I really believe that the communication technologies are democratizing forces. I think they have radically changed the business model in a whole bunch of industries. And in my view, thank goodness in the music industry, it's changed. The same forces have changed the model. But we have to tell the new story. If we don't tell the new story, then it turns out we'll take questions of corporate responsibility as an anomaly. We'll take questions of, in the music business, where an artist as well is only known on the internet. Yeah, it's only 3 billion people that downloaded that video. So
whether something's successful or not depends on how we juxtapose it with the background story. So I'm suggesting that we change the background story so that corporate responsibility and sustainability, acting ethically and creating value, is what we expect. It's the norm. It's not some add-on kind of thing. And I think that's an important thing to at least try to do. Yeah.
Just a couple of comments. The crisis in business ethics in the United States started with slavery and the cultural genocide of the Aboriginal people 400 years ago. It certainly predated WorldCom. And also in the 1930s, the business plot to overthrow FDR. We certainly need revolution in the United States, but capitalism, in my opinion, is completely not the answer. Capitalism is so perverted and corrupted in the United States, and what you have in the U.S. is fascism, is rule of the corporate elite. So I'm really surprised that you looked to capitalism as the greatest innovation. With your experience in Scandinavia, you didn't say social democracy. And the 30 years of privatization and deregulation was because of vociferous lobbying by corporations, knowing that the public purse, the control over energy and water and education and things like that, they wanted it to be privatized because they wanted access to that public purse. And there's no faith in the United States. I mean, I'm a little dissatisfied because there's just no faith with the corporate CEOs. I mean, the greatest disparity on the planet in a country is in the United States between the rich and the poor, and the corporate CEO salaries right now in the United States are totally obscene. And people need to take back the government, and corporations need to be subservient to the people. The government is the people. And I would like to expand on the last point you said about a simple solution. Not only do we need to change the story, but corporations need to pay their taxes, and those taxes need to be reinvested back into the public for our environmental and social purposes. Just a few comments and any reflection that you have, I appreciate.
Good. Well, there's a lot to talk about in that. I think the first thing I would say is that you're absolutely right about, and I certainly don't think that corporate responsibility started around Enron or WorldCom or that sort of stuff. It's a long history of that, even before the institution of slavery with the East India companies, et cetera, et cetera. There's a long history of that. And it's interesting that business schools and business is pretty much ahistorical. And we really need to make it more historical. We could argue about the role of capitalism and government. I have kind of a different view. Capitalism may be the wrong word for me. I'm interested in how business works. I'm interested in how people create value for each other. I have no interest in people who are interested in creating value for one group at the expense of the other. In fact, that's the new story that needs to be told. It needs to be that needs to be enacted. We need to come to see the process of value creation as a cooperative process. I think we can find lots of examples in the world. We may differ on you may think there aren't examples of that. I think there are lots of examples of where that social cooperation takes place, and I want to lift those up. I hope those are there. I don't think I've stylized them, but maybe I have. We may have some arguments again around the political process. It's certainly not easy being an American these days, I can tell you that. Certainly not traveling outside the country. But we do need a reinvigoration of morality in our institutions around the world. We need them certainly in the United States. I won't speak for Canada. I don't know. But we certainly need them there, and we need them in other places. I don't think that rhetoric gets us that. I think dialogue gets us that. And dialogue based on things that we have in common, not on our differences. I hope we can craft that kind of dialogue. I think it's a hard thing to do. I think it's a hard thing to do, especially in a very politicized and sort of fractured environment where we don't know the answer to all the questions. As I've gotten older and traveled more, I've become more and more sure about less and less. And I learned ethics at my grandmother's knee. My grandmother and I had no conversations about globalization. Didn't come up in the fields of Georgia. We had no conversations about genetic technology. We had no conversations about, we did have some conversations about corrupt politicians, but they were in the family. We had no conversations about a lot of the stuff that we got to deal with, that our children have to deal with. And I think we need dialogue and conversation about what those things are. We're never going to have the same view of our history, and that's probably a good thing. But hopefully we'll figure out, and especially at the level of companies, how we can listen to stakeholders, have dialogue with them, and get on with the process of value creation. So I appreciate your comments.
The last question.
You mentioned about how governments have been moving towards selling off of assets as more things move into the private sector, and the decrease of the government role in that. And certainly as Nova Scotians, we can think that's a good thing considering the history of our governments. But I'm wondering if you think it's within the realm of possibility for governments to move in, if they're going to have a role, in more of a positive reinforcement role, even from with larger corporations, their promotions of those who are being responsible socially, economically, as well as providing government grants to young businesses that are starting up, and then on a global perspective, encouraging foreign investment by companies who want to come to a country that is actually being responsible that way.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific role. One of the most interesting, effective policies of government in the U.S. was the sort of bully pulpit to get people to stop smoking, and to do things that are in. The problem, of course, is that it's hard to sort out whose interests are being used here. Governments are not seventh grade civics book, the three branches and the bill through the legislature kind of stuff. They don't work that way. They work in a sort of power and contacts and all that sort of stuff as well. And, most of the people, I do a program in the summertime with 50 state legislators from all over the U.S., and I've found these people to be just incredibly good folks. And what happens is, in the attempt to try and craft legislation that works for everybody in a process that's driven primarily by money, there aren't products that are the outcome. It's the funding the election campaign. The outcome sometimes just doesn't work, it seems to me. But a role for government in which it in a sense encourages moral dialogue in society, I think is absolutely the right role, and one I'd like to see. What I'd like to see more of, rather than this divisive political process that we seem to be addicted to. Right? I think it's a really good idea.
David, I want to thank you and DALHOUSIE a great deal for co-sponsoring with the Canadian Centre of Ethics this event, which is one of many that we've held throughout the year. I also want to thank St. Mary's and Atlantic School of Theology, who kind of have made the Centre for Ethics possible in a number of different and very important ways. I'd like to thank everybody here for your attentive and interested response to Ed's terrific remarks. And you could do us two favors. Number one, we left those little white pieces of paper there. We get remarkably good response rates to those at these meetings, mainly because it's short, and you can probably scribble on it on the way out, and it really helps us to improve our programs. Secondly, somewhere just outside the door, we have a table where you can leave us with your email address, and we will use it for one purpose only, and that is to alert you to the terrific programs that we have coming up in the future, starting in September. And it really helps us to broaden our communications. We don't have a big publicity budget. If you can sort of let us know who you are, and then we can tell you about your programs. That's the only use we put to it. Ed, to you, thank you so much. I need to give you a word of caution with your enthusiasm about dialogue, which I understand, it's well meant. In this particular municipality, we have developed the art of dialogue to fairly well, to the point that it's so good that at the conclusion of it, no actual decision to get taken because people are so fascinated with the dialogue itself, and then we resume the process. So dialogue is great, but it has to lead to decisions rather than be a substitute for them. Your comments about values versus profits, I learned a lot this evening, and I try to teach this stuff, but I learned a lot about how it can be discussed, and I hope through David I can get a hold of your slides so I can plagiarize shamelessly from your work. There's one, I mean, you had so many wonderful examples in play, but there's one that I was actually surprised that you didn't use because it is used so much and in many ways abused so much, and that has to do with Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson's a great company in the pharmaceuticals business. And they are probably most famous for the incident back in the early 80s when there was a product tampering, the first real product tampering event, which led to tamper-proof packaging, and the very decisive and prompt response they had, which was clearly focused on patient outcomes and not on short-term profits. Now, what's interesting about Johnson & Johnson is, first of all, that if you were going to invest in a stock, and particularly if you're going to invest in a pharmaceutical stock, say at the end of the Second World War, you'd be hard put to have done better than to invest in Johnson & Johnson. Secondly, that if you go on the Johnson & Johnson website today, and this is just so in line with what you say, you'll find their credo, which was written actually in the late 40s. Now, I want you to remember that if you happen to look at it, because you'll be astonished at how up-to-date it feels when you read it today. Some of the comments they make about the environment and sustainability and the way they deal with their customers, their patients, and the physicians that are trusting their products and so on. The third thing that's interesting and aligns so well with your comments, Ed, is that after about 4 paragraphs, at the very end, the last sentence, it says, and if we do all this, our shareholders will earn a fair return. After all the other accountabilities that they spelled out to all their different, the word stakeholders hadn't been invented at that time by Ed, but you'll find it aligns very well with your comment. The other thing about Johnson & Johnson's story that I find both interesting and annoying is that people who teach public relations treat it as a triumph in public relations. It was not a triumph in public relations. It was a triumph in values. And good public relations will never fix bad values. They had great values, and the public relations followed from it. So I hold that up because, Ed, you say we need a new story, and in a way maybe you're right, but sometimes I think what we need, there's an old story. Johnson & Johnson is not the only great company that's been doing that for a long time. And in some ways I wonder whether we need an old story that needs being told over and over again in new ways so that people will pay attention to it. It is my earnest hope that your children stay in relatively poorly paying jobs so that you'll be busy for many years saving for their retirement and have to keep telling your story in a new way, because it's great for us, and I know many other audiences will appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill, and big thank you again to Ed for a fabulous contribution this evening. Thank you to all of you for coming out. I will just give a final plug for Ed's new book, which is not actually a doorstop substitute. It's a really, really excellent book with great stories, and I'm pretty sure you'll see it as prescribed reading in a lot of Dalhousie courses in the next year or so, and probably St. Mary's courses too. So Ed's book, his new book, is Managing for Stakeholders, Survival, Reputation and Success, and that's from Yale University Press. So we could organise a mass discount if we get people's names, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of those in the bookstore, at least in the Dal bookstore, in months to come. So thank you again for coming out. Thank you especially to Ed and for Bill to his finishing remarks, and to Chris and the CCEPA for setting up tonight. Thank you again.